Through a maelstrom of biting snow and shrieking wind, a lone figure on a powerful war pony emerged, a silhouette against the gray fury of a Dakota blizzard. He was Cheyenne, his face a mask of deeply etched sorrow, yet his eyes, sharp and assessing, missed nothing. This warrior, Nahko, carried a grief as vast as the plains, a ghost of a man riding towards a scene of utter desperation, a scene that would irrevocably change his solitary path, compelling him to become far more than just a protector to strangers he was about to meet. Huddled against the shattered wheel of a broken wagon, Sarah prayed, her voice a lost whisper against the tempest. She pressed her 3 children, shivering Emily, teeth-chattering Ben, and whimpering little Lucy in her arms, closer to her own body, a fragile, failing shield. Hope had dwindled to a spark, nearly extinguished by the relentless cold and the gnawing fear of what the dawn, if they survived to see it, might bring. Then she saw him, the warrior approaching. Her heart leaped into her throat, a fresh wave of terror washing over her. Nahko had once been a pillar of his sister's community, his lodge warmed by the laughter of his wife, Minowa, and the playful shouts of their son, Little Hawk. His life was one of honor, of providing, of belonging. But that world had been violently ripped away. First, a creeping sickness had weakened their village, then renegade raiders, a brutal mix of outcasts and opportunists, had struck while he was away on a hunt essential for their winter survival. He returned to a nightmare of smoldering ruins and an unbearable silence where laughter used to be. His wife's kin, their sorrow curdled into accusation, had turned on him. He had failed, they whispered, then shouted. He had not been there to protect his own. Their condemnation had been the final blow, driving him into the wilderness, a man hollowed out by loss, his skills as a warrior now serving only to keep a broken heart beating. His normal had become the lonely trail, the silent companionship of his horse, and the unending echo of his profound failure. Sarah, too, was adrift in a sea of recent grief. Her husband, Arthur, a kind man whose hands were as strong as his spirit was gentle, had been taken by a swift, vicious fever just weeks before. Or so the weary doctor in the last dusty town had claimed. A small, persistent doubt niggled at Sarah. Arthur had been the picture of health. Now she was a widow, with 3 small mouths to feed and a perilous journey ahead, hoping to reach a distant cousin who might offer them refuge. The small homestead Arthur had carved from the unforgiving land, their dream, now felt like a trap, isolated and exposed. Her normal was a constant thrum of anxiety, an aching love for her children, and the ever-present fear of the unknown. The blizzard was the cruelest manifestation of that unknown. It had descended without warning, a monstrous white beast swallowing the plains whole. The aged wagon, their only shelter and transport, had groaned under the strain until a wheel finally splintered, the sound like a gunshot marking the end of their fragile hopes. They were stranded, vulnerable, the cold seeping into their bones. Little Lucy's cries grew weaker, a sound that tore at Sarah's soul. Nahko, initially tracking game more out of ingrained habit than actual need, had seen the signs of the approaching storm and taken refuge in a shallow, wooded draw. It was from this vantage that he spotted the faint, desperate flicker of a fire, almost invisible against the swirling snow. Every instinct honed by years of solitude urged him to ignore it, to keep to his own path of mourning. Yet, something deeper, an echo of forgotten warmth, a phantom memory of his own family, huddled by a fire, pulled him forward. He approached with the silence of a stalking wolf, his war pony stepping sure-footedly through the deepening drifts. When Sarah looked up and saw him, a dark, formidable shape materializing from the storm, her breath hitched. She instinctively tightened her grip on her children, her mind racing through every terrifying tale she'd ever heard. They were utterly at his mercy. Nahko dismounted, his movements economical, his gaze sweeping over the scene. The broken wagon, the struggling fire, the terrified woman, the children on the verge of freezing. His face, a canvas of stoic grief, betrayed nothing. He carried the tools of a warrior, a bow, a quiver packed with arrows, a sheathed knife at his hip. For long moments, only the howl of the wind and Lucy's faint whimpers broke the heavy silence. Then, without a word, he set about his work. He gathered fallen branches, his hands moving with practiced efficiency, and skillfully coaxed their dying embers back into a life-giving blaze. He produced dried meat from a pouch at his side, offering it to Sarah, his eyes lingering for a heartbeat on young Ben, whose wide, frightened gaze was a painful mirror of little Hawk's. Sarah's fear, though still a cold knot in her belly, began to recede, replaced by a fragile, desperate tendril of hope. As Nahko helped them reinforce their pitiful shelter against the relentless wind, Sarah noticed his head tilt, his attention seemingly fixed on something beyond the storm's fury. A new, more subtle unease crept into her, a sense that they were not just battling the elements, but perhaps unseen eyes as well. With the first light of a pale, storm-battered dawn, Nahko had intended to depart. Solitude was his companion, grief his shadow. Yet, he found himself hesitating. He watched Sarah, her face pale and drawn but her eyes alight with a fierce, maternal resolve as she comforted her children and surveyed the damage. He saw Emily, barely a girl herself, trying to be strong for her younger brother and sister, her small shoulders set against a world too harsh for one so young. A familiar ache resonated deep within him. He recognized that look, that impossible burden. He made no grand pronouncement, no offer of extended aid. He simply lingered. He told himself it was only until they were mobile again, until the immediate danger of the wilderness had passed. He kept his distance, a silent observer on the periphery of their camp. But his eyes were sharp. He found tracks, not of animals, but of shod horses, too close to their makeshift shelter, too deliberate. He discovered a crudely fashioned snare, meant for game larger than rabbits, hidden in the brush nearby, a silent, unsettling message. A coldness, the kind that precedes human treachery, settled in his stomach. He did not voice his suspicions to Sarah, unwilling to add to her already heavy load of fear. His quietness was a hunter's patience, his stillness a warrior's assessment. Gradually, Sarah's perception of the silent Cheyenne began to shift. His initial, terrifying presence had given way to a strange, unspoken guardianship. One morning, a brace of plump rabbits lay near their camp. Another day, a neatly stacked pile of dry firewood appeared as if from nowhere. He never sought thanks, never initiated conversation beyond a rare, guttural syllable if she addressed him directly. Yet, his watchful presence, once a source of deep unease, was slowly becoming a peculiar comfort, a silent promise of protection in the vast, uncaring wilderness. The first overt threat did not emerge from the natural dangers of the plains, but from men. 3 riders, carrying the air of hired muscle, approached Sarah's camp. They announced they were men of Barth Regis, a name Sarah knew. Regis was a cattle baron, his sprawling ranch swallowing smaller homesteads with alarming regularity, his methods whispered about in hushed, fearful tones. The leader of the trio, a thick-set man named Cully, his face set in a permanent sneer, offered Regis's condolences for her husband's passing and her current predicament. He spoke of Regis's charity, his desire to help a widow in distress. Then came the offer, a pittance for her land, barely enough to feed her children for a month. Cully's eyes, cold and assessing, roamed over Sarah and her meager belongings, lingering on Emily in a way that made Sarah's skin crawl. Sarah, though fear coiled in her stomach, found a well of defiance. She thanked them, her voice steadier than she felt, and told them she intended to keep the land Arthur had worked so hard for. Cully's smile thinned. He remarked that Arthur was gone, and the land needed a man's hand. He suggested Mr. Regis didn't like to see folks suffer. The veiled threat hung heavy in the air. From a rocky outcrop overlooking the camp, Nahko had watched the entire exchange. His hand instinctively went to the knife at his belt. He saw the flicker of fear in Sarah's eyes, the carefully controlled tremor in her hands. He saw Cully's predatory gaze, the blatant intimidation tactics. The faint scent of trouble he detected earlier now reeked of malice. The name Regis meant little to him, but the man's methods were a story as old as greed itself. Regis did not take Sarah's refusal well. A few days later, the small, clear spring from which she drew water turned murky and rank. It had been deliberately poisoned. Next, the handful of scrawny chickens she had managed to protect were found dead, their necks snapped, a discovery made by a heartbroken Ben. These were not random misfortunes. They were calculated acts of cruelty, designed to crush her spirit and drive her from the land. Sarah felt despair closing in. The dream of a new life was turning into a relentless nightmare. She considered abandoning everything, striking out on foot with her children, but the vast, empty prairie stretched before them, a daunting and perilous prospect. One evening, as shadows lengthened and a chill wind whispered through the grass, two of Regis's men returned. Not Cully, but a pair of younger, more reckless thugs, their courage bolstered by cheap whiskey. They circled the camp on horseback, shouting taunts and crude jests, their laughter echoing with menace. One of them, a lanky youth with eyes like chips of ice, dismounted and swaggered towards the lean-to where Sarah was tending a small fire, a meager stew bubbling in a pot. He aimed a kick at the pot, sending it scattering, its precious contents hissing into the dirt. Emily cried out, recoiling in fear. The man sneered, grabbing a strip of jerky Sarah had painstakingly dried, and declared it looked like the squatter had something for them after all. He then lunged towards Emily, his face alight with a brutish grin. In that instant Nahko moved. He erupted from the twilight shadows, a silent, lethal force. Before the ruffian could lay a hand on Emily, he found himself slammed to the ground, Nahko's knee pressing the air from his lungs, the cold, unforgiving steel of a hunting knife resting against his throat. Nahko's eyes, usually filled with a distant, weary sorrow, now blazed with a terrifying, focused rage. He made no sound, no war cry, only a low, guttural rumble that promised swift, final retribution. The second man, startled sober, fumbled for his sidearm, but before his fingers could close around the butt of his pistol, a rock, thrown by Nahko with blinding speed and pinpoint accuracy, smashed into his wrist. The gun clattered uselessly to the earth. The man howled in pain, clutching his shattered hand, all bravado draining from his face, replaced by stark terror. Nahko's voice, when he finally spoke, was barely above a whisper, yet it carried the chilling weight of an avalanche. He told them to leave, now, and to tell Regis this family was under his protection. The two men, thoroughly cowed, scrambled to their feet, practically tripping over each other in their haste to escape, dragging their subdued companion with them. They did not dare look back. Sarah stood frozen, her heart hammering against her ribs, her breath coming in short, sharp gasps. She had sensed his protective nature, but this was the warrior unveiled, a raw and frightening power. For the first time since Arthur's death, a fragile sliver of genuine hope pierced the oppressive cloud of her fear. Yet she knew, with a dreadful certainty, that this was not over. A man like Regis would not be so easily thwarted. Back at his sprawling ranch, Bartholomew Regis listened, his face growing darker with each stammered word from his humiliated men. A lone Cheyenne interfering? Protecting that stubborn woman and her brats? Regis, a man whose immense wealth had been built on ruthlessness and intimidation, felt a vain throb in his temple. He slammed a meaty fist onto his polished desk, the sound making his men flinch. One Indian, he roared, and they had let one savage send them running? Cully, who had remained silent, nursing his own wounded pride, finally spoke. He warned Barth that this was no ordinary brave. The boy said he moved like a phantom, that he had taken down Pike before the man could even blink. Regis's eyes, small and hard, narrowed. Then they would not send boys, he declared. They would send fire and lead. He wanted that woman gone, that land secured, and that Indian's scalp as a stark warning to any who might dare defy him. He ordered Cully to gather every man loyal to him, every gun for hire, They would ride at dusk, he vowed, and by morning there would be nothing left but ashes. The conflict had now escalated beyond threats. It was a declaration of war. Nahko felt the shift in the wind, the tightening coil of impending violence. Regis's men would return, and they would come in force, thirsting for vengeance. He began his preparations immediately, his movements purposeful and efficient. He walked the perimeter of Sarah's small, vulnerable encampment, his warriors noting every rock, every dip in the terrain, every tree that could offer cover or a deadly advantage. He showed Sarah how to reinforce the flimsy walls of their lean-to with a mixture of mud and stones, how to create narrow firing slits that offered protection while allowing for defense. He meticulously cleaned and oiled Arthur's old hunting rifle, then pressed it into Sarah's hands, his instructions for its use brief, almost monosyllabic, but imbued with a grim urgency. Sarah, her fear now transmuted into a steely resolve, worked alongside him. The terror still gnawed at her, a cold pit in her stomach, but it was overshadowed by an overwhelming, primal need to protect her children. She saw the focused intensity in Nahko's eyes, the coiled readiness in his stance, and she placed her unwavering trust in this silent, enigmatic warrior. Emily and Ben, their young faces pale, but set with a courage beyond their years, helped in any way they could, sensing the profound gravity of the situation. As twilight began to bleed across the sky, Nahko slipped away from the camp, a phantom melting into the growing darkness. He moved with an almost preternatural stealth, his senses, honed by a lifetime of survival and conflict, alive to every sound, every scent, every subtle shift in the environment. He found their trail without difficulty, a dozen riders, moving with an arrogant carelessness that bespoke their confidence in overwhelming numbers. He drew closer, concealing himself within a dense thicket of willows and cottonwoods that bordered a shallow, meandering creek. He watched them pass, a grim procession of armed men, led by Cully, who rode at point, while Regis himself hung back, content to observe the anticipated slaughter. Then Nahko's heart constricted, his breath catching in his throat. Dangling from Cully's belt, its cruel lines unmistakable in the fading light, was a hunting knife. It was not just any knife. The handle was wrapped in a distinctive, faded pattern of red and black porcupine quills, a unique, almost imperceptible barb carved near the tip of its wickedly sharp blade. A cold dread, sharp and piercing, shot through Nahko. He had seen that knife before. He remembered it with horrifying clarity. It had been wielded by one of the renegade butchers who had rampaged through his village, who had destroyed his world, who had taken Minowa and Little Hawk from him. The same raiders whose actions had led to his banishment, his in-laws' bitter accusations of failure echoing in his memory. A torrent of emotions, nausea, profound grief, and a terrible, consuming rage surged through him. These men were not merely greedy land grabbers. Cully, at least, was a direct link to the source of his deepest agony, a living embodiment of the brutality that had shattered his life. A dark, inescapable kismet had led him to this desolate patch of earth, to confront the very ghosts that had haunted his waking hours and tormented his dreams. This fight, he now understood with chilling certainty, was no longer just for Sarah and her children. It was a reckoning, a sacred duty. His profound sorrow ignited into a burning, righteous fury. These men, these purveyors of death and despair, would not harm another innocent soul, not while he still drew breath. The assault began as the last vestiges of daylight surrendered to the encroaching night, the western horizon painted in streaks of bruised purple and blood orange. Regis's men, spurred on by Cully's harsh commands and the promise of plunder, charged towards the small, fortified lean-to with wild, blood-curdling yells, expecting to overwhelm any meager resistance with sheer, brutal force. Barth Regis himself watched from a slight rise, a smug, anticipating smile etched on his face. But Nahko was not where they expected him to be. He was not cowering within the lean-to. He had become one with the land, a whisper in the tall prairie grass, a fleeting shadow among the dark, silent rocks. The first volley of shots fired by the attackers went wide, thudding harmlessly into the newly reinforced mud and stone walls, where Sarah and her children were huddled, Emily bravely clutching Arthur's heavy rifle, her small hand surprisingly steady. Then Nahko struck, not with a direct suicidal charge, but with the deadly cunning of a seasoned warrior, fighting on his chosen ground. A nearly invisible tripwire, strung taut between two low bushes, sent the lead horses sprawling, their riders thrown violently to the earth in a chaotic tangle of flailing limbs and shocked curses. From the enveloping darkness, an arrow hissed through the air, finding its mark in the shoulder of a man attempting to set fire to the dry brush near the lean-to. He shrieked in agony, dropping his torch, which sputtered and died in the damp grass. A ripple of unease, then outright panic, began to spread through Regis's men. They could not see their assailant. He seemed to be everywhere and nowhere at once. Another arrow flew, then another, each one finding its target with deadly precision, disabling, disorienting, sowing chaos and fear among their ranks. Nahko utilized the terrain he had so meticulously scouted, moving like a vengeful spirit, his war paint, hastily applied streaks of black and white, ancient symbols of sorrow and retribution, transforming him into a terrifying apparition in the dim, uncertain light. Inside the lean-to, Sarah, her heart pounding a frantic rhythm against her ribs, remembered Nahko's terse instructions. When a shadowy figure, emboldened by the confusion, darted too close to their fragile sanctuary, she raised Arthur's rifle, took a steadying breath, aimed as best she could at the fleeting shape, and pulled the trigger. The roar of the old gun was deafening in the confined space. The shot was likely wild, but its effect was immediate. The figure recoiled, retreating back into the darkness. Young Ben, his small face a mask of fierce determination, saw a stray ember from a dropped torch begin to smolder near a pile of dry kindling close to their wall. Without a word, he darted out, stomped on it with his small, worn boot, and scrambled back to safety, his small act of courage a beacon in the terrifying gloom. Cully, his face contorted with rage and frustration at this unexpected and effective resistance, bellowed at his faltering men, ordering them to charge the lean-to directly. He screamed that it was just one man, that they should rush him, overwhelm him. As Cully, followed by a knot of his most hardened and brutal cronies, surged forward, Nahko met them. He exploded from the shadows, no longer relying on the silent flight of arrows, but wielding his long, razor-sharp knife and a heavy, wickedly effective tomahawk that seemed an extension of his own arm. His movements were a blur of lethal precision, his face a mask of cold, implacable fury. The fight was close, desperate, and brutal. He was heavily outnumbered, but he fought with the incandescent strength of a man who had already lost everything, and who now sought not just to protect, but to avenge. He saw Cully, the man with the accursed, quill-wrapped knife. Their eyes locked across the chaos of the melee. A flicker of recognition, or perhaps merely the primal fear of a cornered predator, flashed in Cully's eyes. "You," Cully snarled, his hand instinctively going to the hilt of the dreaded blade. Nahko's voice was a low, dangerous growl, each word laden with years of unspeakable pain. He remembered that knife. He told Cully. He remembered the screams of his wife, his child, his people. Their ensuing duel was a vortex of savage intensity. Steel rang against steel in the murky darkness. Nahko, fueled by a righteous inferno of grief and rage, fought with a ferocity that stunned Cully and drove him back. Nahko was faster, stronger, his every movement imbued with a desperate, deadly purpose. With a wild, desperate lunge, Cully attempted a low, sweeping cut aimed at Nahko's legs. Nahko sidestepped the clumsy attack with fluid grace, his tomahawk a blur in the gloom, and the fight ended with a sickening, final thud. Cully crumpled to the ground, his lifeblood staining the dark earth, the distinctive, evil knife clattering uselessly beside him. Barth Regis, observing the disastrous turn of events from his safe vantage point, saw his men falter, then break and flee in terror as their formidable enforcer fell. He saw the lone Cheyenne Warrior, standing amidst the carnage, a figure of terrible, awe-inspiring retribution. All of Regis's bluster, his arrogance, his greed, evaporated in an instant. He wheeled his horse around and galloped frantically away into the concealing darkness, his ambitions for this piece of land, and his reputation as an unassailable force, utterly shattered. The remaining attackers scattered like frightened quail, vanishing into the night, leaving behind their wounded, their dead, and their broken confidence. A profound silence, heavy and ringing, descended upon the small, embattled homestead, broken only by Sarah's ragged, hiccuping sobs of sheer relief and little Lucy's soft, exhausted whimpers. The first fragile light of dawn crept over the horizon, illuminating the grim aftermath of the night's desperate battle. The ground around the lean-to was scarred and trampled, littered with the debris of violent conflict. But the lean-to itself, though battered and bruised, still stood. Sarah emerged, her face smudged with gunpowder and streaked with dirt, her children clinging tightly to her skirts, their eyes wide and somber. She saw Nahko leaning heavily against a large rock, his breathing shallow and labored. A dark, ominous stain was spreading across his shoulder, but his eyes, when they met hers, held a new, weary tranquility. The ghosts that had pursued him relentlessly for so long were not entirely vanquished, but they had, at last, been confronted, their power diminished by righteous action. Regis's insidious threat was permanently extinguished. News of the failed assault, of the incredible courage and skill of the lone Cheyenne protector, would spread through the territory like a prairie fire, ensuring that Regis and his ilk would never again trouble this particular stretch of land. Nahko did not ride away with the rising sun. He stayed. He helped Sarah perform the grim, necessary task of burying the fallen attackers, a somber duty carried out in a shared, understanding silence. He showed her how to properly splint the still-damaged wagon wheel, his strong, capable hands moving with quiet expertise. He taught young Ben, whose initial fear of the warrior had transformed into awestruck admiration, how to read the subtle tracks of deer and rabbits in the soft earth. His wound, tended with surprising gentleness and skill by Sarah's own hands, slowly began to mend. The searing pain of his past, the enduring ache of Minowa and Little Hawk's absence, remained an indelible part of him, a scar upon his soul that would likely never fully fade. But here, in this small, broken place, alongside this resilient woman and her courageous children, something new, something unexpected, was taking root. It was not a replacement for what he had irrevocably lost, but it was something else, a renewed sense of purpose, a fragile, tentative connection to the living, a reason to look towards the dawn with something other than resignation. The unforgiving frontier had taken so much from both Nahko and Sarah. It was a land of breathtaking beauty and unrelenting hardship, a place where survival was a daily struggle. Yet in its vast and different expanse, it had also, in its own mysterious way, brought them together. Driven out by the bitterness of his in-laws, a Cheyenne warrior, deep in mourning for his own lost family, had found himself becoming not just a protector, but perhaps something more, a guardian, a friend. And in the quiet resilience of shared survival, the unspoken promise of a new, unconventional family began to blossom, a fragile bloom in the harsh but hopeful landscape of the untamed West. The trail ahead remained uncertain, shrouded in the mists of the future, but for the first time in what felt like an eternity, Nahko did not feel entirely alone as he faced it.